Admiral HFY stood in the command center of his massive warship, staring at the blue and green planet, spinning slowly on the holographic display. Earth looked so small, so defenseless. After conquering 12 different worlds across the galaxy, this looked like it would be the easiest victory yet. The hologram showed him everything he needed to know: primitive rockets that barely reached their own moon, weapons that fired metal, bullets instead of energy beams. Most amusing of all, the humans couldn't even agree on one government. They were split into hundreds of different countries, constantly arguing and fighting among themselves. "Sir, our intelligence report is complete," said Lieutenant Vextar, approaching with a datapad in his clawed hands. "Human military technology is at least 300 years behind our weakest allies. They still use chemical explosives and projectile weapons. Their fastest ships take months to travel distances we cover in hours." HFY nodded, his 4 eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "And their unity? Non-existent, Admiral. They have something called nations that compete for resources. Some are actively hostile to others. We detected at least 47 separate military forces across their planet. They waste enormous resources fighting each other instead of preparing for external threats." The Admiral chuckled, a sound like grinding metal. "Perfect. Deploy the standard demonstration protocol. A few orbital strikes on empty areas, some intimidating broadcasts, and they'll surrender within 1 rotation. Have the occupation forces ready to land by tomorrow. What about resistance, sir?" With their technology, their divided leadership, HFY waved a dismissive hand. "There won't be any meaningful resistance, mark my words, Lieutenant. In 1 week, we'll be filing our conquest report and moving on to the next system." Far below on Earth's surface, in a small apartment in Seoul, Jin-Ho was having a very different kind of conversation. The emergency deployment notice had arrived on his secure phone just 20 minutes ago. Now he sat on the edge of his bed, methodically checking his gear while his wife Soo-Jin watched from the doorway. Jin-Ho's hands moved automatically, checking magazine springs, testing flashlight batteries, inspecting every piece of equipment. After 20 years in the military, these actions were as natural as breathing, but Soo-Jin could see the weight in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when he thought she wasn't looking. "The news says they're not hostile," Soo-Jin said quietly. "The aliens, I mean. They say they just want to talk." Jin-Ho didn't look up from his rifle. "Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but someone has to be ready either way." "You're 43 years old, Jin-Ho. You've given enough." Now he did look up, and Soo-Jin saw something in his dark eyes that made her chest tight. It was the same look he'd had when he came back from Afghanistan, the look that said he'd seen things that couldn't be unseen, done things that couldn't be undone. "I've got experience they need," he said simply. 3 tours, overseas, urban combat, guerrilla warfare. If these visitors turn out to be unfriendly, all that ugly experience might actually be useful for something good. Soo-Jin sat down beside him on the bed. She'd been married to a soldier for 15 years. She knew better than to argue about duty. "Will you come back?" she asked instead. "Always have before," Jin-Ho replied, but they both heard the hesitation in his voice. Both remembered the nightmares, the therapy sessions, the long nights when he'd wake up thinking he was still in Kandahar or Kabul. Jin-Ho stood and shouldered his pack. Through their apartment window, they could see other lights in other windows. Families having similar conversations, veterans getting similar calls. All across the city, all across the country, all across the world, people who'd seen war before were preparing to see it again. "I love you," Soo-Jin whispered as he headed for the door. "I love you too. Take care of Min-Ju while I'm gone." Tell. Her daddy went to work. As Jin-Ho walked down the stairs of their apartment building, he couldn't shake the feeling that this deployment would be different from all the others. Not because of advanced alien technology or superior numbers, but because this time, Earth's scattered, battle-scarred veterans might finally have a common enemy that would unite them. He had no idea that Admiral HFY was making the biggest tactical error in galactic history. The aliens had studied human technology, human governments, even human biology, but they had completely overlooked the one thing that would destroy their invasion. Human veterans who had learned to fight dirty, think creatively, and never, ever give up. Warriors who carried their wars inside them, always ready to use that darkness to protect what they loved. The hegemony's demonstration fleet descended through Earth's atmosphere with absolute confidence. Admiral Kexiva had ordered a show of force designed to break human morale instantly. Massive ships positioned themselves over major cities, their dark hulls blocking out the sun. Energy weapons charged up, ready to vaporize empty buildings as a warning. But when the aliens looked down at the cities below, something was wrong. The streets were empty. No panicking crowds, no desperate governments trying to negotiate, no terrified civilians begging for mercy. Just silence. "Where are they?" Lieutenant Vextar asked, staring at the tactical display. "Our sensors show millions of life signs, but the streets are completely deserted. Underground, probably," Kexiva replied dismissively. "Hiding in their primitive shelters. Begin landing operations. Deploy demonstration units to secure key positions. Once they see our ground forces, they'll come crawling out to surrender." The first wave of dropships launched with military precision. Each ship followed the exact same flight path, landed at the exact same distance from strategic targets, and deployed troops in the exact same formation. It was textbook hegemony doctrine, perfected over dozens of successful invasions. On a rooftop in Seoul, Park Do watched the alien ships through his rifle scope and smiled grimly. The former army sniper had lost his left arm to an IED in Syria 3 years ago, but his shooting hand was steady as ever. More importantly, his mind was sharp from years of studying enemy patterns. "Just like we thought," he whispered into his radio headset. "They're doing everything by the book. Same approach. Vectors, same landing zones, same troop deployment. It's like they've never fought anyone who shoots back." Park Do had spent 2 tours learning that the enemy's greatest weakness was often their greatest strength. Rigid discipline made armies effective, but it also made them predictable, and predictable enemies were dead enemies. He adjusted his position slightly and began calculating wind speed and distance. His prosthetic arm held the rifle steady, while his good hand worked the bolt. "Squad leaders, this is Overwatch. Targets are in position. Execute on my mark." 3 blocks away, Kim Yu crouched in the basement of an abandoned office building, surrounded by maps, radio equipment, and supply crates. The former logistics coordinator had learned her trade during earthquake relief operations, moving food and medicine through destroyed cities when normal transportation was impossible. Now she was moving ammunition and medical supplies to resistance fighters scattered across the city. The aliens had no idea that Seoul's subway tunnels, service corridors, and underground shopping centers formed a network that connected almost every major building in the downtown area. "Team 7, you have ammunition waiting at exit point, Charlie." She spoke quietly into her headset. "Team 3, medical supplies are cached at your secondary position. Remember, hit fast and disappear. Don't try to hold ground." Kim Yu's screen showed the positions of every alien patrol in real time. Her network of spotters, many of them veterans like herself, tracked enemy movements and reported back through encrypted channels. The aliens might have superior technology, but they were walking through a city where every window could hide an observer, every building could hide a fighter. The first attack came at exactly 03:47 hours. Park Do's rifle cracked once, and an alien squad leader dropped instantly. Before his body hit the ground, crossfire erupted from 3 different buildings. The remaining aliens dove for cover, but their training worked against them. They formed defensive positions exactly as their manual instructed, which put them exactly where Kim Yu's fighters expected them to be. Grenades rolled out of storm drains. Sniper fire came from unexpected angles. When the aliens tried to call for backup, they discovered their communication equipment was being jammed by modified civilian electronics. "This is Patrol 7. An alien voice crackled over intercepted radio. "We are under attack. Unknown number of hostiles. Request immediate support." But support was having its own problems. All across the city, alien patrols were walking into carefully planned ambushes. Veterans who had learned urban warfare in places like Fallujah and Kabul were applying those hard-earned lessons to alien invaders. Lee Min, a former combat engineer, had spent the previous day rigging improvised explosive devices in locations where alien patrols would naturally take cover. When the fighting started, every piece of debris, every overturned car, every logical hiding spot became a potential death trap. Meanwhile, Cho Sung and his team moved through the subway tunnels like ghosts, hitting alien positions from behind and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. The aliens' advanced sensors were useless in the maze of underground passages that the humans knew by heart. By 0500 hours, 3 alien outposts had gone completely silent. The creatures who had expected to be filing occupation reports were instead calling desperately for emergency evacuation. Their perfectly planned invasion was falling apart because they had never encountered an enemy that refused to fight fair. Admiral Kexavor stared at his tactical display in disbelief. Red icons marked lost patrols, severed communications, and positions under attack. This wasn't how invasions were supposed to work. Where was the organized military response? Where were the uniformed soldiers fighting from fixed positions? What he didn't understand was that Earth's veterans had already learned the most important lesson of modern warfare. The enemy's strength is irrelevant if you refuse to fight on their terms. Hegemony Mind Warrior Thexel materialized in the center of Busan like a nightmare-given form. His species had evolved beyond physical combat centuries ago, developing psychic abilities that could shatter minds from a distance. He was their secret weapon, deployed only when conventional forces failed. Thexel had broken the will of entire planets. On Kepler 442b, he had driven an entire species to madness in just 3 days. On Proxima Centauri C, warrior cultures that had fought for millennia laid down their weapons and wept uncontrollably after experiencing his mental assault. His psychic powers could implant pure terror directly into a victim's mind, showing them their worst fears made real. "Begin the pacification protocol," he commanded his escort. "This primitive species will crumble within hours." Thexal closed his multiple eyes and reached out with his mind, searching for human consciousness to destroy. He found his first target quickly, a soldier hiding in a damaged building just 2 blocks away. The alien began his assault, projecting waves of overwhelming fear and despair. But something was wrong. Li Jun felt the alien presence like distant thunder rolling across his mind. He was crouched in the ruins of an apartment building, checking his rifle and trying to coordinate with other resistance fighters scattered throughout the city. When the psychic attack hit him, he paused for just a moment, then continued cleaning his weapon. "That's interesting," he muttered to himself. Li Jun had been fighting battles inside his own head for 5 years now, after 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. He'd come home carrying invisible wounds that were harder to treat than any physical injury. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the constant feeling that danger was lurking around every corner, even in peaceful places. But therapy had taught him something valuable. His mind had already been broken and rebuilt. The process had been painful, like setting a bone that had healed wrong and breaking it again to fix it properly. But now his thoughts were structured differently than before, organized around coping mechanisms and mental barriers that he'd built brick by brick. When Thexel tried to implant terror, he found those walls already in place. Li Jun's mind had its own security system, developed through years of learning to function while carrying trauma. The alien's psychic probe felt like just another intrusive thought, something to acknowledge and then dismiss. "Nice try," Li Jun whispered, then spoke into his radio. "Team leaders, be advised. The aliens have some kind of mental attack capability. Feels like a strong anxiety episode. Use your breathing exercises and keep fighting." 3 buildings away, Choi Na was having a similar experience. The former combat medic had seen more death and suffering than most people could imagine. She'd held dying soldiers while rockets exploded overhead, performed surgery in the back of moving vehicles, and made life-or-death decisions when there were no good options available. When Thexal's psychic assault hit her, she recognized it immediately. "Classic panic attack symptoms," she said calmly, checking her pulse. "Elevated heart rate, sweating, sense of impending doom. But I know what this is." Choi Na had learned to compartmentalize trauma as part of her medical training. When everything around you is chaos, you have to find a way to think clearly and act decisively. Her mind had developed its own filing system, keeping emotional responses separate from tactical thinking. She continued coordinating the resistance fighters under her command, using her medical knowledge in ways the aliens never expected. Choi now understood how stress affected human performance, how fear could be managed, and how pain could be ignored when necessary. More importantly, she knew how to help others do the same. "Listen up, everyone," she broadcast on the resistance frequency. "The aliens are trying to mess with our heads, but remember your training. Fear is just information. Pain is just a signal. We've all been through worse than this." Thexal was becoming increasingly frustrated. His psychic powers, which had never failed before, were having no effect. He reached deeper, drawing on more energy, projecting images of death and destruction directly into human minds. But the humans kept fighting. In fact, they seemed to be getting more organized. Veterans who had survived combat were sharing coping strategies over radio channels. Someone was teaching breathing exercises. Another voice was explaining how to recognize and ignore intrusive thoughts. What Thexal didn't understand was that many of Earth's veterans had already fought this exact battle. They'd struggled with their own minds in hospital beds and therapy sessions, learning to function despite carrying psychological wounds. The aliens' mental attack was just another enemy to defeat, using tools they'd already developed. Kang Su, a former Special Forces operator, actually laughed when the psychic assault hit him. "You think you can scare me?" he said out loud. "I've been living with worse than this for 6 years. My own brain is more creative at torturing me than you." So the resistance fighters began adapting in real time. They shared techniques for staying focused under mental pressure. They paired up veterans with newer fighters, teaching them how to recognize and resist psychological manipulation. By sunset, Thexal was exhausted and confused. His most powerful weapons were useless against minds that had already been tested by their own darkness and emerged functional. The humans weren't just resisting his attacks, they were learning from them, turning his psychic assault into training exercises. Admiral Kexfor received the report with growing alarm. "What do you mean your mental powers don't work on them?" "They're already broken, sir," Thexal replied wearily. "But somehow they've learned to fight while broken. Their minds are like weapons forged from their own wounds." The Void. Reapers descended on Busan like living nightmares. These weren't ordinary hegemony soldiers. They were the Empire's ultimate weapon, elite psychic warriors who had broken the minds of entire civilizations without firing a single shot. Each Reaper stood 9 feet tall, wrapped in shadow-like armor that seemed to absorb light itself. Admiral Kexivor had deployed them as his final solution. Regular troops were failing, mind warriors were being ignored, and human resistance was growing stronger instead of weaker. The Void Reapers were his last resort, creatures so terrifying that most species surrendered just by sensing their presence. "Deploy the Reapers in the most heavily defended sectors," Kexivor ordered. "These humans need to understand what true fear means." The first Reaper, Vorthak, materialized in an abandoned shopping district where resistance fighters had been particularly active. His psychic abilities were so powerful that small animals within a mile radius simply died from terror. Plants withered. Even the air seemed to grow cold and heavy. But Kang Min was already moving. The former reconnaissance specialist felt the alien presence before it fully materialized. His skin prickled, his heart rate increased, and every instinct screamed danger. Most people would have dismissed these feelings as paranoia, but Kang Min had learned to trust his hypervigilance. After returning from 2 tours in Iraq, he'd struggled with what doctors called PTSD. His nervous system remained stuck in combat mode, constantly scanning for threats that weren't there. He'd jump at loud noises, couldn't sleep without checking locks multiple times, and felt exhausted from being perpetually alert. But tonight, for the first time in 6 years, his hypervigilance was exactly what he needed. "Something big is coming," he whispered into his radio. "Everyone needs to move now." Kang Min had learned to function while carrying invisible wounds. Therapy had taught him that his symptoms weren't weaknesses but adaptations. His brain had rewired itself for survival, developing an early warning system that most people didn't possess. When Vorthak unleashed his psychic assault, Kang Min was ready. The alien tried to flood his mind with overwhelming terror, projecting images of death and hopelessness. But Kang Min's damaged nervous system processed the attack differently than a healthy mind would have. "You think you know darkness," he whispered. Slipping through the shadows between buildings, I've been living with it for 6 years. We're old friends now." The terror that should have paralyzed him instead triggered familiar survival responses. His breathing remained controlled. His hands stayed steady. His mind catalogued escape routes and tactical options, even while the Reaper's psychic assault tried to crush his will. In another part of the city, Park Jae was having a similar experience. The former infantry soldier had lost 3 friends to an IED explosion in Afghanistan and spent years afterward convinced that he should have died with them. Survivor's guilt had nearly destroyed him, but eventually he'd learned to carry that weight without being crushed by it. When the second Void Reaper, Zentoth, targeted him with waves of guilt and self-hatred, Park Jae actually smiled grimly. "That's all you've got? My own brain comes up with worse than this every Tuesday." The alien's psychic attack felt like an echo of thoughts he'd already processed in therapy. The Reaper was trying to break him with emotions he'd already learned to survive. Meanwhile, Songhai moved through the underground tunnels beneath the city. The former military police officer had developed severe anxiety after witnessing a terrorist attack during her deployment. For years, crowded spaces and loud noises would send her into panic attacks, but the tunnels were different. Down here, her anxiety transformed into tactical awareness. Every sound had meaning. Every shadow could hide an enemy or provide cover. Her damaged nervous system, which made normal life difficult, was perfectly adapted for this underground war. When the third Void Reaper tried to implant claustrophobic terror, Songhai laughed. "You picked the wrong person to mess with underground. This is where I feel safe." The Reapers had never encountered anything like this. Their psychic powers worked by exploiting mental weaknesses, amplifying fear and despair until their victims became helpless. But these humans had already lived through their worst mental states and developed ways to function despite them. Li Wu, a former combat engineer, had learned to work through panic attacks during bomb disposal missions. When Vorthak tried to overwhelm him with anxiety, he simply applied the breathing techniques he'd learned in therapy and continued setting up explosive traps. "Breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4, he muttered while connecting. Detonator wires. Just another day at the office. The Void Reapers found themselves in an impossible situation. Their greatest weapons were useless against minds that had already been tested by trauma and rebuilt stronger. These humans weren't just resisting psychic attack, they were using their own psychological wounds as armor. As the night wore on, the supposedly invincible Reapers began to retreat. They were facing an enemy that couldn't be broken because they were already broken and had learned to fight with the pieces. Veterans who had survived their own darkness were now using that experience to navigate through alien-induced horror. Vorthak's final report to Admiral Kexivor was brief and confused. "The humans are immune to our powers. They carry their own darkness and somehow use it as a weapon. We cannot break what has already been broken and rebuilt." By dawn, all 3 Void Reapers had withdrawn from Busan, their psychic powers rendered useless against an enemy that had already fought the hardest battle of all, the war inside their own minds. Admiral Kexivor stared at his command screen in disbelief. Red warning lights flashed across every tactical display. Half his ground forces were either missing or calling. For emergency evacuation, his elite Void Reapers, who had never failed before, were requesting immediate withdrawal. The invasion that should have taken 3 days was collapsing after just 18 hours. "Sir, we're receiving multiple distress calls," Lieutenant Vextar reported, his voice shaking. "Patrol 7 is trapped in underground tunnels and taking heavy casualties. The 3rd Battalion hasn't reported in for 6 hours, and the humans somehow jammed our communications grid using modified civilian electronics." But what truly terrified Kexivor was the report sitting on his desk from ship security. Somehow, impossibly, a human had infiltrated his flagship. Not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through simple observation and pattern recognition. Songbi moved through the alien command ship like she belonged there. The former military intelligence analyst had spent years studying how organizations functioned, and more importantly, how they failed. She'd learned these skills not just from training, but from rebuilding her own life after trauma had torn it apart. During her deployment in Syria, Songbi had been captured and held for 6 days before rescue arrived. The experience had broken something fundamental inside her. For months afterward, she couldn't trust her own judgment, couldn't sleep, couldn't function in normal situations. But therapy had taught her something valuable about how systems collapse under pressure. Whether it was a terrorist cell, a military organization, or a damaged human mind, they all followed similar patterns when they started to fail, and Song Bi had become an expert at recognizing those patterns. The alien ship was showing all the classic signs of systemic breakdown. Confused orders contradicting previous commands, personnel abandoning their posts without authorization, communication failures cascading through the entire network. She'd seen the same thing happen to her own psyche, and she knew exactly how to accelerate the process. Song Bi accessed the ship's internal network through an unguarded maintenance terminal. The aliens had excellent security against external attacks, but they'd never considered that someone might infiltrate their ship physically and attack from within, just like how her own trauma had bypassed all her mental defenses by coming from inside. She began introducing small errors into the ship's systems, nothing dramatic enough to trigger automatic safety protocols, just minor glitches that would accumulate over time. A communication delay here, a sensor calibration error there, a navigation update that was off by just a few degrees. "Admiral," Vextar called out urgently, "we're getting conflicting reports from all sectors. Navigation says we're drifting off station. Engineering reports power fluctuations. And somehow our secure communications are being intercepted by human forces." Kexavor realized with growing horror that his perfect military machine was falling, apart from the inside, but he still didn't understand how a primitive human had managed to outthink his advanced security systems. Song Bi understood because she'd lived through the same process. When trauma strikes, it doesn't announce itself or follow logical rules. It finds the weak points in your defenses and exploits them in ways you never expected. Recovery meant learning to recognize those patterns and strengthen the vulnerable spots. She'd applied the same principles to the alien ship. Instead of attacking their strengths, she targeted their assumptions. They assumed their security was perfect, so they didn't monitor for internal threats. They assumed their technology was superior, so they didn't consider low-tech solutions. They assumed humans were primitive, so they never expected tactical thinking that came from lived experience rather than formal training. "Sir, I recommend immediate withdrawal," Vextar said desperately. "Our ground forces are reporting that human resistance is actually increasing. Every time we deploy a new weapon, they adapt to it within hours. It's like they've been preparing for this kind of war their entire lives." That's when Admiral Kexavor finally understood his fatal mistake. He'd studied human technology, human governments, even human biology. But he'd completely misunderstood what human veterans really were. He'd assumed they were broken soldiers, damaged goods left over from primitive conflicts. Instead, he'd encountered something far more dangerous: warriors who had learned to transform their wounds into weapons, veterans who had survived trauma that should have destroyed them and emerged with capabilities that no training could provide. The invasion was over. Kexavor gave the order he'd never given before in his long military career: full retreat, all units withdraw immediately. As the alien fleet disappeared beyond Earth's atmosphere, humans across the planet began to emerge from their hiding places. The victory felt surreal, but it was real. They had won not through superior technology or numbers, but through something the aliens couldn't understand or replicate. Jin Ho walked through the door of his apartment in Seoul just as the sun was setting. So Jin ran to embrace him, tears streaming down her face. Their 7-year-old daughter Minju looked up at her father with wide, curious eyes. "Daddy, why do soldiers always look sad?" she asked innocently. Jin Ho knelt down to her level, thinking about his friends who hadn't made it home from previous wars, about the nightmares that still visited him sometimes, about the invisible scars that all veterans carried, but also about how those same scars had somehow saved humanity. "Because, little one," he said quietly, pulling both his wife and daughter into a hug, "sometimes the things that hurt us also teach us how to protect what we love. And sometimes that's the most important lesson of all." The news would spread across the galaxy within weeks. The mighty hegemony, conquerors of a dozen worlds, had been defeated by a species they'd considered primitive, but more importantly, They'd learned a truth that would change how every civilization viewed Earth. Never mistake scars for weakness. They're proof that someone survived what should have destroyed them and learned to fight with the pieces.